So, welcome everyone at our first session in this semester. Our speaker today is John Cottingham. Professor Cottingham is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Reading University and an honorary fellow of St. John's College, Oxford University. He has published several books, including some classics on Descartes, on the meaning of life, on ethics, and philosophy of religion. Today, he's going to raise the question, which naturalism? So, Professor Cottingham, with this short introduction, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me and see me? I see a few nods. Good. Naturalism is a notoriously slippery concept which can cover a multitude of different positions. If you look at A, quotation A there, what Brian Leiter enthusiastically hails as the naturalistic revolution in philosophy is driven by an uncompromising secular and materialist worldview. But materialism comes in many varieties and need not necessarily be crudely reductionist in character. For example, John Dupre, he points out that reductionism has been almost entirely rejected by materialist philosophers actually engaged with the physical and biological sciences. Dupre seems right insofar as few contemporary philosophers would maintain that all true statements about the world can be translated without remainder into statements about material entities or their interactions. But the dominant naturalist paradigm does nevertheless seem committed to the metaphysical doctrine that ontologically speaking, there's ultimately nothing but the world as described by physics. Anything else, as Dupre himself exists, must be outlawed from acceptable philosophical discourse as spooky, and crucially, only what is, as he puts it, empirically grounded, in that quotation there, can escape being so outlawed. But this just shifts the problem of defining naturalism onto a concept that's equally problematic, that of the empirical. As the logical positivists soon discovered now nearly a century ago, and many of the debates over naturalism can seem uncannily like replays of the old arguments over positivism. But as they discovered, it's very difficult to formulate a criterion for being empirically supported or confirmed by experience in a way that's liberal enough to accommodate blue chip scientific theories, yet stringent enough to rule out, for example, religious assertions, which their defenders can plausibly claim they can plausibly point to experiences in the life of the believer that go at least some way to supporting these claims. So if the naturalist is simply someone whose worldview is supported by experience, then the term's not going to be much use in separating out types of worldview. And this in turn points to the thought that the interesting question in this area may be not whether your view of the natural world is supported by experience, but rather how you conceive of the natural world, how you conceive of nature in the first place. If you're a naturalist, then which naturalism do you espouse? I think it's clear that Aristotle, the Stoics, Aquinas, Spinoza, and even Descartes all construed nature in far richer terms than the modern secularist. So far from being the poet A.E. Housman's heartless, witless nature, just a brute concatenation of contingent structures that is, in the immortal words of Bertrand Russell, just there. nature was, for all these earlier writers, something that partakes of the divine, or even, as in the case of Spinoza, is itself divine. If you go back to Aristotle, talk of nature belongs in a metaphysical framework where nature, as Aristotle puts it, does nothing in vain. The natural world is configured teleologically so that each natural thing tends towards the good, tends towards the goal wherein its good consists. Or if we take another example from the ancient world, in Stoicism, we're told to live in accordance with nature, vivere secundum naturam. And here, so far from being an evaluatively neutral notion, nature refers to an objectively rational order. And living in accordance with nature really means living in accordance with the same rational and normative principles that govern the cosmos as a whole. And coming down to the early modern period, we see Descartes saying in the sixth meditation, this is C for Charlie on the sheet. By nature in general, I mean nothing other than God himself, or the ordered system of created things established by God. And as far as human nature is concerned, Descartes defines it as the totality of things bestowed on me by God. So Descartes makes it clear, taking his cue largely from Aquinas, that a vital part of our human endowment consists in the natural light. And that's it's a highly normative notion denoting the light of reason, which gives us access to what's objectively true and good. So all this puts into a slightly different perspective the naturalizing agenda of our contemporary secularist philosophers. For insisting that the human world and all its products have to be brought within the domain of the natural, they're advancing a thesis that many classical, medieval, and early modern philosophers and theologians would have regarded as pretty much self-evident. So what's changed, I think, is not a new determination to include within the natural domain what was previously excluded from it. Rather, there's been a radical shift in how the natural domain is to be understood. If you like, a shift in the metaphysical construal of the doctrine, of the concept of nature. So let me come on to the second section about nature and the supernatural. Contemporary naturalists often tend to define or characterize their outlook not so much in terms of what they mean by the term natural, as in terms of their rejection of its supposed opposite, the supernatural. This is one of the main planks in the platform of the philosopher Julian Baggini's atheism, which he takes as defined, this is D on the sheet, in opposition to what he thinks of as a supernatural or non-natural notion. He says, I don't believe in spooky non-natural forces, and goes on to equate the real with what is fully part of the natural world. That's in a recent book called The Godless Gospel. The aversion to supernatural or spooky forces turns out to be one of the main drivers of contemporary secular naturalism. A common complaint here is that the idea of the supernatural explains nothing. So if we look at E there, Richard Dawkins, he says that to claim a supernatural explanation of something, not to explain it at all, even worse, rule out any possibility of its being explained. He goes on to say supernatural must be by definition beyond the reach of a natural explanation, so beyond the reach of science. So to say that something supernatural is just to say, not just to say we don't understand it, but we'll never understand it, so don't even try. And he goes on to point out in that quotation that the whole history of science shows that things that were once thought to be beyond the reach of scientific explanation, caused by the gods or by demons, witches, and so on, actually do have natural explanations. No reason to believe these things for which science does not, that the remaining things for which science doesn't have an explanation will not one day be brought within the purview of science. No reason to think they'll turn out to have a supernatural origin. I think there's a lot of truth in this claim about how science has advanced and its success in explaining phenomena once thought to be supernatural. So I think we can extrapolate from that and think that the category of the supernatural is often dependent on the resources which are available within a given epoch, within the scientific framework of a given epoch. So, for example, in the 17th century, in the Cartesian conception of physics, matter is construed simply as extended stuff, whatever can be explained, characterized, I should say, geometrically in terms of size, shape, and the size and shape of the particles making up matter. So from this perspective, energy, motive power, is in a certain sense supernatural, at least in the sense that it's anomalous, extraneous to matter as then conceived. And hence, for the followers of Descartes, since it couldn't be derived from the properties of mere extension, it ultimately had to be imparted to matter by God. Yet as science progresses, the idea of energy and motion as something extraneous to matter becomes progressively eroded. And from Einstein onwards, with the discovery of the intimate relation between mass and energy, matter starts to be considered as naturally and inherently energetic. The boundaries of what's explicable in natural terms, where natural has the thin sense of intrinsic to matter, have now dramatically expanded. And if we come down to very recent terms, excuse me, the increasingly well-attested phenomenon of quantum entanglement is in a certain sense weird or spooky by reference to the framework of Einsteinian physics, since it seems to involve the transmission of information faster than the speed of light. But we can certainly agree in the spirit of Dawkins' remarks that dubbing this phenomenon supernatural would solve nothing. Indeed, I think it's hardly imaginable that any scientist would nowadays invoke the deity as the cause of quantum entanglement in the way in which Descartes, in his 1644 Principia, invoked God as the cause of motion. To be sure, the phenomenon of quantum entanglement is anomalous with respect to certain parts of the current scientific framework, but this is taken to be something that further scientific theorizing and experimentation will eventually resolve, rather than something that requires us to posit anything supernatural. So far so good, and so far consistent with Dawkins's analysis. But it's easy to slide from this plausible truth about the explanatory redundancy of supernatural explanations in physics to a much more questionable claim, that the methods and procedures of natural science are in principle equipped to explain the whole of reality. Yet the problem with that more ambitious thesis, equating the limits of science with the limits, ultimate limits of reality, is that there are plainly many parts and aspects of reality that simply don't figure in the world as investigated and described by natural science. To be human is to have access to a whole rich world of meaning and value, mediated through a complex interlocking network of practices and discourses. So, art, music, literature, philosophy, and indeed scientific inquiry itself, it's such work, all such work, its products, its characteristic activities, its discourse, and its subject matter form part of the reality we inhabit. And all these multifarious phenomena can't even begin to be described or explained in terms of the abstract, quantitative, or mechanistic terms of physics or the terminology of the other natural sciences. The reasons for this have been, of course, widely discussed in the literature, including a recent paper by David MacArthur, I think puts the point very incisively. This is F from a paper of 2018, where he says there are truths about mind, meaning, and morals that, being rationally normative, constitutively depend upon non-scientific forms of understanding. Now, I don't think it will do for the modern scientistic naturalist to say, as Dawkins did in that work I just quoted, The Magic of Reality, that yes, these things are real, but they depend, this is a quote, yes, these things are real, but they depend for their existence on human brains, end of quote. Well, of course, all the complex phenomena just mentioned couldn't be conceived or apprehended if there were not beings like humans with complex brains and nervous systems. But while these cognitive faculties we possess as biological creatures, creatures with brains, may allow us to access this rich world of meaning and value, they don't in themselves create or invent it. Our biological, that's to say, they allow us to perceive it and to respond to it, not to create it. Our biological grounded and culturally shaped sensibilities, to borrow a phrase from John McDowell, bring into view genuine aspects of reality that were there already. So if we take nature as the totality of the real world, comprising all the reality that we apprehend, including these phenomena I've just referred to, how do we frame our conception of nature so as to do justice to its richness? We've seen that much richer conceptions of nature were available in the classical and early modern periods. And although there may be many aspects of these earlier systems that are now no longer tenable, it still seems we need an enriched or expansive naturalism, to use a term coined by Fiona Ellis in her groundbreaking book, God, Value and Nature, 2014, an expansive or enriched naturalism which allows us to count as real the value-laden, meaning-saturated aspects of the world we inhabit. I don't think this need be a matter of introducing spooky forces or Cartesian ghosts into our ontology. It's not that there's the natural world and then in addition, there are weird, spooky entities. Rather, the thought is that we need some way of accommodating the fact that the natural world, the world we human beings inhabit, the world we refer to in our daily discourse, is already replete with value. So let me come on to the third section, which introduces this familiar idea of enframing. I think if we accept what I've so far said, the next step that suggests itself is that in order to understand the value we find in the world, we need recourse to some kind of interpretative framework. And here, I think we can borrow, or perhaps I should say adapt, the Heideggerian concept of Gestell, or enframing, as set out in his 1954 essay, The Question of Technology, Der Frage nach der Technik. This notion is initially deployed in the context of warning us against the dangers posed by the technological revolution. The enframing constituted by the grip of technology transforms the world into a totalizing network of resources lined up for exploitation, where everything is assessed in terms of its instrumental value. But Heidegger also indicates, citing a famous poem of Hölderlin, that where there is danger, there's also the hope of salvation. And this gives some support to Federico Campagna's more positive interpretation of enframing. This is G. Anything that appears to us as a true element of the world, that is anything whose truthfulness, aletheia, consists in the removing of the veil that hid it from us and its emergence as an object of our experience, does so within a certain frame. So, as well as the kind of technological enframing that alienates us from the world, there might be alternative frameworks that are more benign, indeed, which enable us to perceive what is hidden. And I think this is part of what Heidegger is suggesting in his famous essay on the origin of the work of art, Der Ursprung des Kunstwerkes, where he emphasizes the power of art to disclose reality. This gives us a different kind of enframing, where a work of art becomes die schaffende Bewahrung der Wahrheit, the creative custodianship of the truth. So artistic creation is not a mere projection of our wishes onto reality, but rather that which allows reality to manifest itself. And in a later essay, Das Ding, the thing, Heidegger produces a variation on this theme, where through the eyes of poetic imagination, even an ordinary object like a jug or pitcher is seen as a vehicle of gift. This is H. The giving of the gift, the giving of the outpouring can be a drink. The outpouring gives water, it gives wine to drink. The spring stays on in the water of the gift. In the spring, the rock dwells. In the rock dwells the dark slumber of the earth, which receives the rain and dew of the sky. In the original, the highly charged poetic language continues almost in ecstatic vein, celebrating nature and the natural world as something in which we are intimately involved and united in a kind of process of giving and receiving. Well, without going any further into that, I think the relatively straightforward idea we can take from Heidegger's essay is that the very idea of nature and the natural world can't be understood as an unproblematic given to be characterized in neutral, colorless neutral terms. Its reality is something we strive to understand and to interpret. And this very attempt presupposes that we come to nature already armed with frameworks of interpretation: scientific, technological, artistic, poetical. But equally important, in our interpretations, we strive to be true to the phenomena, to allow that which is real to be disclosed to us. So far as one can see at this stage, and I'll come back to this, there's no reason for privileging any one framework or saying it provides an exclusive or exhaustive route to disclosing the true character of nature, the natural world, reality as it is. So with this in mind, just consider, for example, this description by a Benedictine monk, Luigi Gioia. This is J, quotation J, where a certain kind of enframing, in this case a theological one, or a theistic one rather, conditions the way in which the daily rhythms of the natural world are understood and perceived. Liturgical activity transforms cosmic, historical, and biological rhythms into salvation history. The night becomes a time of waiting for the Lord, the rising of the sun, a time to celebrate creation, the succession of daily hours, an ascent to the heavenly Jerusalem, the end of the day, a celebration of redemption, sleep, an act of abandonment in God's hands. In this way, the monk constantly remembers he's not the creator and savior of himself, that he's a creature and in God's presence doesn't exist as a self, but as a thou. This sense of calm and peace that seems to invest the diurnal cycle of sunrise and sunset reminds one, I think, of Wittgenstein's description of the religious outlook as involving a feeling of absolute safety. Nothing can injure me, whatever happens. And that may tempt us to characterize the difference between the theistic view of nature, what we could call theistic naturalism, with its antithesis, the typical contemporary scientific naturalism, by saying that the first one involves an essentially benign view of nature, while the second involves a conception that it's a best neutral, or worse, involving what Dawkins calls blind, pitiless indifference. Now, if you set it up that way, that may seem to set things up for a dismissal of theistic naturalism as a sort of naive refusal to look facts in the face. How can we consider the natural world as benign if we think of the world devastated by COVID, for example, which may loom large for us, but in fact is clearly just one item in an endless catalogue of earthquakes, tsunamis, plagues, famines that have marked the history of the planet. But I think that's too simplistic. To accuse the theistic conception of a refusal to face reality is actually a distortion of the way the natural world is actually viewed in the theistic tradition. If we just go back to Wittgenstein, who described himself as having a strong sympathy for the religious outlook, even though he was himself unable to accept it or embrace it, at least. In the passage, he talks of the feeling of absolute safety. He goes on to stress this is obviously different from a feeling of safety you have about some ordinary matter, like feeling safe that you can't get whooping cough because you've once had it already. I mean, to the ordinary way of thinking, you might be safe from whooping cough, but there are obviously lots of other diseases you can get and things that are going wrong or could go wrong. So to say that you're safe whatever happens is in a literal sense nonsense. But Wittgenstein argued that shouldn't lead us to dismiss such language out of hand, since it's inevitable thinking religion will sooner or later run up against the boundaries of language. But it's thinking, according to Wittgenstein, that springs from a tendency in the human mind that demands deep respect, even though it may not add to our scientific knowledge. But quite apart from that point, if we look at the attitude to nature actually found in the theistic worldview, we find it's very far from asserting a comfortable, cozy, natural world where all the forces of nature conduce to our benefit. If you take the Hebrew Bible, for example, the long history of plagues and pestilence is certainly not airbrushed out of the story, quite the reverse. And in the descriptions of nature found, we often have an acknowledgement, even underlining, of the threatening wildness and power of nature. In the Psalms, for example, the lions roaring after their prey, the fire and hail, snow and vapors, wind and storm, the gales that strip the forest bare, while all cry kavod, glory. So the natural world is depicted as awful, awful in the literal sense, inspiring fear, and yet also filling us with a kind of wonder and strange delight. It's notable that these are precisely the emotions that Richard Dawkins celebrates in his book, The Magic of Reality. A purely natural magic, he's at pains to stress, yet something that fills us, as he puts it, with awe and delight. So just as the psalmist stresses the utter puniness of humankind against the backdrop of the starry heavens, so Dawkins declares that our local galaxy, the mysterious streak of milky white across the sky, across the night sky, which, quote, we can never see in its full glory, should, quote, when you realize what it is, strike you dumb with awe. So the atheist is adamant in rejecting the theistic framing of the natural world, but the sheer beauty and glory of nature that the theist celebrates by calling it divine or charged with the grandeur of God, in Gerard Manley Hopkins' famous phrase, is precisely what calls forth the awe and wonder of those who reject religious language. So I think what we have here is a remarkable convergence in our natural human responses to the world, a convergence that should perhaps deserve more attention from philosophers than the largely fruitless attempts to either rule in or rule out the supernatural, which we find in so many of the contemporary debates in this area. So having pointed to some striking this is section 4 now, on human nature. So having pointed to some convergences between theistic and atheistic conceptions of nature, let me now turn to a particular subdomain of nature, namely human nature, where things aren't so simple. I referred earlier to Descartes' conception of nature as, looking back to C, nothing other than God himself. But in the second part of that quotation, he says, by my own nature, I understand nothing else than the totality of things bestowed on me by God. Now, this rich, value-laden conception of nature, as I said earlier, very much extended to the conception of human nature, which was conceived in medieval and early modern times as partaking of the divine in at least two respects. The first of these was the natural light, the lumen rationis, or lux rationis, or lumen naturale, the natural light, in virtue of which we humans are endowed with the divinely bestowed power of rational intuition, which allows us to use Cartesian language to clearly and distinctly perceive the basic truths of logic and mathematics. And the second aspect is the light, the natural light of conscience, which, in the words of Joseph Butler in the 18th century, is the natural guide, the guide assigned to us by the author of our nature, which enables us to know the basic principles of morality. If we compare these traditional theistically based views of our natural endowment as humans with modern secular naturalism, here, not surprisingly, we find a very striking divergence, perhaps in contrast to the convergence I was suggesting in views of nature as awe-inspiring. In the case of our human nature, theistic naturalism, despite the doctrine of original sin, according to which, as Augustine and Aquinas declare, we're clouded in our intellect and enfeebled in our will, nevertheless, there's a firm view of human nature according to which it bears the stamp of the divine. Well, clearly we are unable to follow John Milton in Paradise Lost in eavesdropping on the origins of the human race so as to check on its metaphysical credentials. So let's, for present purposes, take a leaf out of the pragmatist's book and just put on one side the metaphysics and ask what is the cash value or practical implication of this traditional doctrine of the imago Dei, the idea that we bear the stamp of the divine. I suggest there are two principal aspects to it. First, though humans are evidently prone to error in manifold ways, the doctrine of the natural light of reason asserts consistently from Aquinas down to Descartes and beyond that humans, at least with respect to certain basic fundamental logical intuitions, are equipped to discern the truth. This is what Descartes says. This is L in the second replies to the objections to the Meditations. In the case of our clearest and most careful judgments, if such judgments were false, they couldn't be corrected by any clearer judgment or by means of any other natural, there's that word again, faculty. In such cases, I simply assert it's impossible for us to be deceived. So at the most fundamental level, our nature is inherently responsive to the true. And the second implication of the divine stamp on our nature is that we are inherently responsive to the good. In a sense, this isn't distinct from the first, since in Aquinas, for example, the good and the true are interconvertible. So in the view of Aquinas, if someone eagerly pursues an evil end, for example, bullying another human being, they will nevertheless retain, in spite of themselves, some residual pull in the opposite direction. Eleanor Stump, American philosopher of religion, Eleanor Stump, has underlined in several of her recent writings that Aquinas is committed to the idea of an objective standard of goodness to which, at least in its rudiments, no human being can be indifferent. And a striking conclusion follows, namely that no one can be, as she puts it, wholehearted in evil. Just quote Stump for a moment, this isn't on the sheet. A person who lacks one or another degree of integration in goodness will hide some part of his mind from himself and so be alienated from some of his own desires. In short, theistic naturalism gives us a picture of human nature that is strongly teleological. We have a destination that's laid down for us, and we're equipped, at least in principle, to discern and pursue that destination. So there's something we are meant to be, a way we are meant to be. We are, as it were, configured towards the good. Well, how does this twofold affirmation of theistic naturalism, conception of human nature as fundamentally oriented towards the true and towards the good, how does this compare with the picture presented by contemporary secular naturalism? Well, I guess the ruling idea behind the secularist naturalist framework is that our human nature is shaped and configured by the engine of evolution, by the mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection. And this in turn suggests the general principle that our human faculties will be configured in terms of functional utility for survival. Yet, as several philosophers have pointed out, this doesn't of itself entail or even make it probable that the faculties in question will be configured towards the true. This is discussed amongst others by Alvin Plantinga in a debate in a volume entitled Knowledge of God. He focuses here on the neural structures associated with a given belief content. For example, the belief that there's a predator in the area. As a result of having that neuronal event, the creature in whom this event has been found believes a certain proposition. But what reason is there to think that proposition is true? Granted, the structure in question helps cause adaptive behavior, but that doesn't so much as slyly suggest that the content that gets associated with the structure is true. As far as causing the right kind of behavior is concerned, it simply doesn't matter whether the content that associated with that proposition that associated proposition is true or false. At this point, as far as the truth or falsity of the content that arises, natural selection just has to take pot luck. Well, there are some issues there which no doubt are problematic, but I think the broad lesson to emerge from Plantinga's argument is that on the typical secular conception of our human nature, there's no systematic principled linkage between our possession of equipment that's turned out to be beneficial in the evolutionary struggle for survival and our supposed ability to track the truth with respect to the most evident intuition of our intellect. An exactly parallel problem arises for the secular naturalist, I think, with respect to the moral domain, where the question is how the contingent mix of survival pressures could deliver a species with the capacity to discern and respond to the good. this problem is very insightfully, I think, explored from a secular perspective by Bernard Williams in his Making Sense of Humanity, where he somewhat ruefully reminds us how the Darwinian framework presents human nature as a kind of ragbag, a disparate amalgam of genetically determined and culturally inherited propensities and dispositions, which there's no principal reason to suppose will converge on a satisfactory vision of the good for humankind. Just give you Williams here, this is quotation N for November. The most plausible stories about human evolution, including its very recent date, and also certain considerations about physical characteristics of the species, suggest that human beings are to some degree a mess, like that phrase, and that the rapid and immense development of symbolic and cultural capacities has left humans as beings for whom no form of life is likely to prove entirely satisfactory, either individually or socially. There's a pessimism here apparent that's a direct consequence of Williams' determination to accept what he called the first and hardest lesson to be learned from the eclipse of theism and the rise of Darwinism. This raises all sorts of questions which can't be settled here about whether theism can be reconciled with what we now know about the origin of our species. But I think at least this point becomes very clear from Williams. The framework of secular naturalism is such as to make very implausible any idea that human nature is fundamentally oriented towards the good. So let me briefly conclude. As I've been suggesting, the philosophically interesting question turns out to be not whether we should be naturalists, but which of two naturalisms we should adopt. Secular naturalism, with its neutral or blank conception of the domain of nature as a whole, and of our own human nature in particular, along with these arguably pessimistic implications for how we see ourselves, or the older theistic conception, according to which both the natural world and our own nature bear the stamp of the divine. Well, one might, I suppose, try to validate the latter theistic conception as Aquinas or Descartes did by constructing independent metaphysical arguments for God's existence and the divinely created status of the cosmos, including ourselves. But in my view, the Enlightenment critique of metaphysics has sufficient force to show that there's really little scope for constructing a metaphysical bridge to the transcendent, starting from the meager resources available to these imbecile worms of the earth, as Pascal called us human beings. But as the arch-atheist David Hume pointed out, where reason gives out, nature must take over. To respond to the natural world with awe and wonder is a deeply ingrained human impulse, and as has appeared, one found in atheists as well as theists. The language of theism vividly expresses this wonder, telling us, for example, that the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. We can't deny the power and resonance of such language, though of course this won't prevent the secularist from dismissing it as a mere projection of anthropomorphic characteristics onto the impersonal cosmos. And I think the result, as far as this goes, the cosmos as a whole, is a standoff. I mean, there may be resources available to tip the scales, as I've discussed elsewhere, but they're beyond the scope of this paper. But when we turn from the cosmos as a whole to our own human nature, there I think things are different. Theistic language, with its talk of human nature as bearing the stamp of the divine, may have become deeply uncongenial to contemporary secular philosophy. But nevertheless, the conception of human nature is fundamentally configured towards the good and the true, may be one that we can't give up on pain of self-stultification. For our very sense of ourselves as philosophical and scientific inquirers, able to critically sift and evaluate our beliefs and discern which goals are worthy of pursuit, and to pursue them with coherence and purpose. All this seems to presuppose that at some fundamental level, the human mind is indeed what Thomas Nagel has called, this is the final quotation, an instrument of transcendence, able to grasp objective reality and objective value. So in other words, whatever long and tortuous evolutionary process may have spawned us, our human endowment includes a faculty which is in principle capable of pointing us towards an objective domain of truth and goodness, where objective refers to something beyond our own contingent inclinations and preferences, something that constrains and guides our choices. I mean, of course, this doesn't mean we have a hotline to the truth or a guaranteed route to goodness. Obviously, our manifest human failings rule that out. But it does mean that in our view of ourselves, we are obliged, on pain of cognitive and moral paralysis, to have faith in the truth of something like what I'm calling theistic naturalism. If there is not within humankind something of what's traditionally been called the divine, something akin to what the canonical theistic philosophers call the natural light, then we'd have to accept that there's no principled reason to hope that our intellectual and moral projects have a chance of success, or even that they can be coherently formulated in the first place. And these are hopes that we could not abandon without ceasing to be human.